The lonely rancher hired a plain-faced woman as cook, never suspecting her quiet strength would resurrect the heart he had entombed with his wife. Her simple words pierced the armor of his grief, awakening feelings he had vowed would remain forever dormant. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go! The golden hour cast long shadows across Mason Ridge as Emmett Blackwood stood on his porch, watching dust devils dance across the parched earth of his cattle ranch. 6 years alone had hardened him like the drought-cracked soil beneath his boots. 6 years since Sarah had taken her last breath, leaving him with 1,000 acres, a herd of ornery cattle, and a silence that rang louder than any storm. He ran a calloused hand through his salt and pepper beard, squinting at the horizon where the Montana sun bled crimson across the sky. The ranch hands had left for the day, returning to their own lives in town, leaving Emmett to the hollow echo of his own footsteps across wooden floors. The thought of another night of cold beans straight from the can turned his stomach. 6 years of that was enough to drive any man to desperate measures, which explained the wrinkled newspaper clipping in his shirt pocket, an advertisement he'd placed 3 weeks ago in the Billings Gazette. Cook needed at Mason Ridge Ranch. Room and board provided. Inquire in person. Simple, direct, with no mention of his preference for someone who wouldn't try to fill the void Sarah left. Someone practical, who would keep to themselves and let him do the same. The distant rumble of wheels caught his attention. Squinting against the dying light, Emmett saw a weathered wagon approaching, pulled by a single dappled mare that had seen better days. He hadn't expected anyone to respond to his ad, not really. Mason Ridge was too remote, the work too demanding for most. Yet here was someone arriving just before nightfall, kicking up dust along the lonely road that led only to his doorstep. Emmett straightened, adjusting his hat and brushing the worst of the day's dirt from his shirt. Not that appearances mattered much out here, but his mama had raised him with manners buried somewhere beneath years of solitude. The wagon slowed to a stop in front of the house, and Emmett's brow furrowed. A woman sat on the driver's bench, her posture straight despite what must have been a grueling journey. She wore a simple gray dress that had faded to the color of morning mist, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to soften the angles of her face. Plain didn't quite capture it. There was something almost stern in the set of her mouth, the sharp line of her jaw. She wasn't young, but not old either. Somewhere in that undefined middle that spoke of experience and hardship. Blackwood? Her voice carried across the yard, clear as a bell despite the dust of travel. Emmett nodded, stepping down from the porch. You found him. She gathered her skirts and climbed down from the wagon with practiced efficiency. No wasted move. Up close, he could see the small lines around her eyes, the weathered quality of her skin that spoke of a life lived outdoors. Her eyes were her most remarkable feature, gray as storm clouds and just as turbulent. Eleanor Walsh, she said, extending a hand that was neither soft nor delicate, but strong and capable. I've come about the position. Emmett took her hand briefly, surprised by the firmness of her grip. You're a long way from anywhere, Miss Walsh. Mrs., she corrected, though no husband was in sight. And distance doesn't trouble me. Emmett studied her for a moment longer. Not what he'd expected. Not that he'd had clear expectations, but there was something reassuring in her no-nonsense demeanor, the way she met his gaze without flinching. No pity there, no curiosity about the widower in his empty house, just a woman seeking work, nothing more. You can cook? A simple question, though the answer mattered more than he cared to admit. A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, crossed her features. I wouldn't be here if I couldn't, fair enough. Emmett gestured toward the house. There's a room off the kitchen, nothing fancy, pays $30 a month plus room and board. That will do. She returned to the wagon, pulling out a single trunk that she managed on her own despite Emmett's instinctive step forward to assist. I can manage, she said, the words neither sharp nor soft, just matter of fact. They entered the house together, silence stretching between them. Emmett was acutely aware of the state of his home. Not dirty exactly, but neglected in the way only a house without a woman's touch could be. Functional, but without warmth. Eleanor didn't comment, her eyes taking in the main room with its sparse furnishings, the fireplace with cold ashes, the kitchen beyond with its cast iron stove and bare cupboards. When was the last time a proper meal was cooked here? She asked, running a finger along the counter and examining the dust. Emmett shifted uncomfortably. Define proper. Eleanor's eyes met his. For a moment he thought he saw a ghost of a smile, something that didn't come from a can or wasn't fried in its own grease until it resembled shoe leather. Despite himself, Emmett felt the corner of his mouth twitch. About 6 years then, she nodded. No questions about the significance of that time frame. Another point in her favor. I'll need supplies, she said, already rolling up her sleeves. And that stove needs cleaning before it's fit to cook anything edible. There's a list, Emmett said, nodding toward a paper on the table. Things the ranch hands mentioned needing. I was planning to go into town tomorrow. Eleanor picked up the list, scanning it with a critical eye. This won't do, she murmured, more to herself than to him. She found a pencil and began adding items, her handwriting neat and precise. Emmett watched her, suddenly feeling like a stranger in his own home. It had been so long since anyone but him had moved through these rooms with purpose. I'll start on the kitchen, she said, handing him back the expanded list. Is there anything salvageable in the pantry? Some flour, maybe? Coffee? Salt? Eleanor sighed, a sound that somehow conveyed both disappointment and determination. We'll make do tonight. Tomorrow will be better. There was a promise in those words that stirred something in Emmett, something he quickly tamped down. He retreated to his chair by the cold fireplace, listening to the sounds of Eleanor moving about the kitchen, opening cupboards, running water from the pump. Ordinary sounds that had been absent for too long. By the time darkness fell completely, she had worked what seemed like magic. The kitchen, while still in need of supplies, gleamed with unaccustomed cleanliness. And somehow Emmett couldn't quite figure how she had produced a meal that, while simple, was the first hot, home-cooked food to pass his lips in years. Cornbread that crumbled just right, beans that had been transformed with some herbs she must have brought with her, and a ham bone she'd found God knows where, coffee that didn't taste like it had been brewed with creek water. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the hollow silence Emmett had grown accustomed to. This was different. Companionable almost. When they finished, Eleanor began clearing away the dishes. "You don't have to do that tonight," Emmett said, surprising himself. "It's been a long journey." Eleanor paused, dishes in hand, and looked at him directly. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice level, "I believe in ending each day with things in order. It makes the next day start better." Such a simple statement, yet something about it caught in Emmett's chest. How long it had been since he'd thought about tomorrow as anything but a continuation of today's emptiness. "Besides," she continued, turning back to her task, "I was hired to cook and keep house. I intend to earn my wages." Emmett watched her work, her movements efficient, nothing wasted. There was a grace to her that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with purpose. For the first time in 6 years, he found himself wondering about someone else's story. What had brought Eleanor Walsh to his door? What had put that look of quiet determination in her storm-gray eyes? But he didn't ask. Questions led to conversations, and conversations led to connections. And connections, Emmett had learned, led inevitably to loss. Instead, he said simply, "Breakfast at dawn. The hands come in at noon for dinner." "I'll be ready," she replied, not turning from her work. Emmett nodded, though she couldn't see it, and retreated to his bedroom. As he closed the door, he heard her humming softly, not a happy tune, but something with a bittersweet quality that followed him into dreams he hadn't known he could still have. Morning arrived with unfamiliar scents drifting under his door. Coffee, yes, but also biscuits baking and the rich aroma of gravy. For a disorienting moment, Emmett thought he had somehow slipped 6 years into the past. Then reality settled over him like his worn leather vest as he dressed for the day. Eleanor was already moving about the kitchen when he emerged, her hair neatly pinned, her sleeves rolled up as she worked at the stove. She didn't smile when she saw him, but nodded in acknowledgement. "Hope you're hungry," she said, setting a plate before him as he sat at the table. Emmett looked down at food that bore no resemblance to his usual cold breakfast. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," he said gruffly. Eleanor paused, a coffee pot in her hand. "It's no trouble, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly. "It's what I'm here for." And somehow, in the early morning light filtering through windows that seemed cleaner than they had been just yesterday, those simple words settled into Emmett's chest like seeds falling on long fallow ground. In the weeks that followed, Mason Ridge Ranch transformed under Eleanor's steady hand. The change was subtle at first. Shelves that no longer collected dust, windows that caught the light instead of blocking it, floors that didn't creak quite so mournfully. The kitchen, once a hollow reminder of what had been lost, became the beating heart of the house once more. The ranch hands noticed it too. They lingered longer at the noon meal, making excuses to stay for just one more cup of coffee, one more slice of Eleanor's apple pie. Even the most weather-beaten among them remembered to wipe their boots before entering, responding to Eleanor's quiet dignity with a respect that surprised Emmett. "Never seen Hank take his hat off indoors," Emmett remarked one evening after the men had left. The dinner table cleared save for their coffee cups. Eleanor's hands paused briefly as she wiped down the counter. "Men respond to expectations," she said simply. Even when unspoken, it was the kind of observation that made Emmett wonder again about her past, the life that had preceded her arrival at Mason Ridge. But true to his resolution, he didn't ask, and Eleanor offered no stories of her own. Their routine settled into a comfortable rhythm. Breakfast before dawn, a brief exchange about the day's work. Emmett would leave to tend to the cattle, mend fences, and manage the endless tasks that came with ranching. Eleanor would keep the house, prepare meals, and somehow find time to plant a small kitchen garden that promised fresh vegetables come summer. They rarely spoke beyond what was necessary, yet in the silence between them grew something that, while not quite companionship, was no longer the awkward coexistence of strangers. It was a quiet understanding, a mutual respect for boundaries, until the night of the storm. It rolled in from the north, a wall of thunderheads that turned the evening sky the color of a fresh bruise. Emmett came in from the barn, rain already beginning to slash sideways across the yard, the wind driving it like nails. "Cattle are secured," he said, shrugging off his dripping coat. "Storm's gonna be a bad one." Eleanor nodded, setting a steaming bowl of beef stew before him. "I brought in extra wood for the stove." The temperature's dropping fast. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the kitchen in stark white before plunging it back into the warm glow of the oil lamps. Thunder followed almost immediately, a sound that shook the windows in their frames. "Too close," Emmett muttered, spooning stew into his mouth. Eleanor moved about the kitchen with her usual efficiency, but Emmett noticed a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. When another crack of thunder shook the house, he saw her flinch, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. "You all right?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. She straightened immediately, of course, just as Storm. But her voice lacked its usual conviction, and Emmett found himself studying her more carefully. There was something in her expression, a vulnerability he hadn't seen before, quickly masked but undeniably present. The wind rose to a howl, rattling the shutters like something alive was trying to get in. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets, and the temperature in the house dropped despite the fire in the stove. Eleanor moved to close the heavy curtains, her hands steady but her face pale in the lamplight. "I should check on your room," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Make sure the windows are secure." "They're fine," Emmett said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his tone. "Sit down, Mrs. Walsh. Your work is done for the day." She hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to sitting while he was still at the table. Another crash of thunder seemed to make the decision for her. She sank into the chair opposite him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Would you like some coffee?" Emmett offered, already rising to pour her a cup from the pot she kept warming on the stove. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Isn't that my job? I think I can manage to pour coffee without burning down the house," he replied, setting a steaming cup before her. The storm had driven them into uncharted territories, small talk, a shared moment that wasn't strictly necessary. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the cup, seeming to draw comfort from its warmth. Another flash of lightning, another deafening roll of thunder, and this time the lights flickered ominously. "I don't care for storms either," Emmett found himself saying, if only to fill the silence with something other than the screaming wind. Eleanor looked up, surprise evident in her eyes. "I wouldn't have thought you afraid of anything, Mr. Blackwood." "Not afraid," he corrected, settling back into his chair. "Just ... They remind me of things I'd rather forget." He hadn't meant to say that much, hadn't planned to open even that small window into his past. But there was something about the storm, about the forced intimacy of being trapped inside with only the sound of rain and Eleanor's steady presence across the table. "The war?" she asked quietly. Emmett nodded, surprised she had guessed so easily. "Spent 3 years in places where thunder meant something else entirely. Sometimes I still wake up reaching for a rifle that isn't there." Eleanor's eyes held his, not with pity but with understanding. The mind remembers what the body wants to forget. Such a simple statement, yet it cut through Emmett like a hot knife through butter. How long had it been since anyone had truly understood? Not offered empty platitudes or awkward sympathy, but genuinely understood. "Yes," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "That's exactly it." The lamps flickered again and went out, leaving them in darkness broken only by the occasional flash of lightning and the dim glow from the stove. Emmett rose to light the kerosene lamp he kept for such occasions, the match flaring bright in the darkness. In that brief illumination, he caught a glimpse of Eleanor's face, unguarded in a way he hadn't seen before. There was a softness there, a depth of feeling that her usual composure concealed. With the lamp lit, the kitchen returned to its warm glow, a small island of light in the storm-tossed night. Emmett found himself reluctant to end this rare moment of connection. "Would you mind if I told you a story, Mrs. Walsh?" he asked, settling back into his chair. "To pass the time until this blows over." She looked surprised but nodded. "I'd like that." So Emmett spoke of lighter things, a troublesome bull calf that had escaped 3 times in one, a horse he'd had as a boy that could untie any knot. Nothing too personal, nothing too revealing, but stories nonetheless. And as the night deepened and the storm gradually moved eastward, Eleanor's shoulders relaxed, the tension easing from her face. When the thunder was just a distant rumble, she surprised him by offering a story of her own about a goat that had once eaten her father's prized almanac and then followed him around for days as if to prove it knew as much about weather as he did. It wasn't much, just a small glimpse into a life before Mason Ridge, but Emmett treasured it like water in a drought. He found himself searching her face as she spoke, noticing how animation transformed her features. She would never be conventionally beautiful, but there was character in every line, strength in the set of her jaw, and something unexpectedly tender in her eyes when she spoke of her father. The storm passed, leaving behind a cleansed world and an altered atmosphere between them. Not dramatic, but perceptible, like the first green shoot after a long winter. The next morning they returned to their usual routine, neither mentioning the unusual candor of the night before, but something had shifted. A door cracked open that had previously been sealed shut. Emmett began to linger a bit longer at breakfast, occasionally commenting on more than just the day's work. Eleanor, in turn, seemed less rigid in her formality, sometimes sharing observations about a bird's nest under the eaves or the progress of her garden. 1 month stretched into 2, and spring unfurled across Mason Ridge in a riot of wildflowers and new grass. The cattle grew fat on fresh pasture, and the days lengthened into the golden evenings of early summer. It was on one such evening that Emmett came in from the fields earlier than usual, drawn by the scent of something baking that brought a long-forgotten memory rushing back. He paused in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, struck by the sight before him. Eleanor stood at the stove, her back to him, the late afternoon light streaming through the window catching in her hair, turning the practical bun into a crown of subtle fire. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms strong from work, and she moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in her surroundings. For the first time, Emmett allowed himself to really look at her, not as his cook, not as an employee, but as a woman who had brought life back into his home one careful step at a time. She hummed softly as she worked, a melancholy tune that seemed to carry all the weight of unshared stories. Something tightened in Emmett's chest, an unfamiliar ache that was not entirely unpleasant. He must have made some small sound, for Eleanor turned, their eyes meeting across the warm, fragrant kitchen. "You're early," she said, neither pleased nor displeased, merely stating a fact. "The Westfield can wait till morning," he replied, still standing in the doorway, uncertain why he felt suddenly like a trespasser in his own home. A strand of hair had escaped her bun, falling across her cheek. Without thinking, Emmett took a step forward, his hand half raised as if to brush it back. He caught himself, the gesture incomplete, awkward in its abandonment. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, her hands stilling on the cloth she held. For a moment they stood frozen in a tableau of almost connection, the air between them charged with unspoken words. "Blackberry cobbler," Eleanor said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. She gestured to the oven with the cloth in her hand. "Found a patch down by the creek this morning. Thought it might make a nice change." Emmett lowered his hand, clearing his throat. "Sarah used to make that. Blackberry cobbler." The name fell between them like a stone in still water. In the 3 months since Eleanor's arrival, he had never once spoken his wife's name aloud. Eleanor's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of the significance of the moment. "I can make something else," she offered quietly. "No," Emmett said quickly. "No, it's fine." It was her favorite thing to bake, is all. Eleanor nodded, turning back to her work with deliberate movements. "My mother taught me," said a good cobbler could soothe most troubles. It was the most she had ever volunteered about her past, and Emmett found himself hungry for more in a way that had nothing to do with the enticing smells filling the kitchen. "Was she right?" he asked, moving to the table and settling into his usual chair. Eleanor's hands paused briefly. "About some troubles, yes." She looked over her shoulder at him, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Others require stronger medicine." There was a story there, Emmett was certain, but before he could decide whether to ask, a knock at the door pulled his attention away. Frowning visitors were rare at Mason Ridge, especially in the evening. He rose to answer it. A man stood on the porch, hat in hand, his clothing marking him as neither a ranch hand nor a local farmer. There was something citified about him, despite the dust of travel that clung to his boots. "Mr. Blackwood?" the stranger asked, his voice carrying the clipped tones of the East. "That's right," Emmett replied, instantly wary. "Walter Jenkins, sir. I represent the Western Pacific Railroad Company." The man extended his hand, which Emmett shook briefly. "I was hoping to have a word with you regarding a business proposition." Emmett hesitated, then stepped back, gesturing the man inside. "You've come a long way. Might as well hear what you have to say." Jenkins entered, removing his hat and looking around with the assessing eye of a man accustomed to calculating value. His gaze settled briefly on Eleanor, who had emerged from the kitchen, then returned to Emmett with barely concealed surprise. Clearly, he hadn't expected to find a woman at the ranch. "My cook, Mrs. Walsh," Emmett said, the introduction feeling strangely inadequate. "Mrs. Walsh, Mr. Jenkins from the railroad." Eleanor nodded politely. "Would you care for coffee, Mr. Jenkins? Dinner's nearly ready." The railroad man smiled, a practiced expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Coffee would be most welcome, ma'am." "Thank you." As Eleanor returned to the kitchen, Jenkins lowered his voice. "I hadn't realized you had a household, Mr. Blackwood. My information suggested you lived alone." Something in the man's tone, a hint of insinuation, perhaps raised Emmett's hackles. "Mrs. Walsh is employed here," he said firmly. "Now what's this proposition?" Jenkins settled into a chair, placing a leather portfolio on the table. "The Western Pacific is expanding its lines through this territory, Mr. Blackwood. The most direct route would cut through the eastern portion of your property." Emmett stiffened. The eastern section contained some of his best grazing land, as well as the creek that provided water for much of the ranch. "Not interested," he said flatly. Jenkins raised a placating hand. "I understand your reluctance, but I urge you to consider. The railroad would be willing to pay a generous sum." "Money's not the issue," Emmett cut in. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations. I don't intend to carve it up for anyone, railroad included." Eleanor returned with coffee, setting cups before both men with quiet efficiency. If she had overheard their conversation, her face revealed nothing. "Dinner will be ready shortly," she said, her eyes meeting Emmett's briefly before she withdrew again. Jenkins watched her go, then leaned forward. "Progress is coming to this territory, Mr. Black, whether you welcome it or not. The railroad means prosperity, faster shipment for your cattle, better prices at market, access to goods that you can now only dream of. I've got all I need," Emmett replied, though even as he said it, he was aware of the half-truth in his words. Until recently, Mason Ridge had felt like nothing but an empty shell of what it once was. Jenkins' smile tightened. "Perhaps, but consider your neighbors. Many have already signed agreements with us. Holdouts only delay the inevitable." Anger flared in Emmett's chest, hot and sudden. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Jenkins?" "Not at all," the railroad man replied smoothly, "simply stating facts. The governor himself has expressed support for our expansion. Eminent domain is a possibility for those who refuse reasonable offers. There's nothing reasonable about cutting through my water source," Emmett growled. Jenkins sipped his coffee, his composure unruffled. "Our engineers have surveyed multiple routes. There are alternatives, but they would add considerable expense to the project. Expense that could be better used to compensate cooperative landowners." Before Emmett could respond, Lenora appeared in the doorway. Emmett raised an eyebrow. She usually ate after him, or sometimes not at all in his presence. She met his gaze with a slight nod, as if to say this was a deliberate choice. The meal was one of her best roast beef cooked to perfection, potatoes browned just right, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and green beans from her garden. The promised blackberry cobbler waited on the sideboard, its sweet aroma mingling with the savory sense of the main course. Jenkins made appreciative noises as he ate, complimenting Eleanor with the practiced charm of a man accustomed to making favorable impressions. "You're fortunate to have found such a skilled cook, Mr. Blackwood. Good help is hard to come by in these parts, I imagine." "Yes," Emmett agreed, watching as Eleanor served herself with precise movements. "I am fortunate. Have you been with Mr. Blackwood long, Mrs. Walsh?" Jenkins inquired, turning his attention to Eleanor. She met his gaze directly. "3 months? And before that?" Something in Eleanor's posture changed, a subtle stiffening that Emmett might not have noticed had he not become attuned to her every movement. "I was employed in Billings," she said, her tone discouraging further inquiry. Jenkins, however, seemed determined to draw her out. "As a cook as well? You have exceptional skill." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, her voice neutral. "Mr. Blackwood, would you care for more bread?" Emmett accepted the offered plate, noting the slight tremor in her hand. Turned to Jenkins, deliberately changing the subject. "You mentioned other ranchers have signed agreements. Which one?" The conversation shifted back to business, but Emmett remained aware of Eleanor's discomfort. She participated minimally, answering direct questions with polite brevity, but otherwise kept her focus on the meal. When she rose to serve the cobbler, Emmett saw relief in the set of her shoulders. The dessert was everything her mother had promised, sweet, tangy, with a crust that melted on the tongue. Emmett found himself transported briefly to another time, another woman's hands creating this same dish, yet the memory brought no pain, only a bittersweet appreciation for both past and present. "Extraordinary," Jenkins pronounced, setting down his spoon. "Mrs. Walsh, you have a remarkable talent." Eleanor inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I don't suppose you'd consider a position in the city? The railroad maintains a fine dining car on its premier routes, and we're always seeking skilled cooks. The pay would be considerably more than what a ranch can offer." Emmett's hands stilled, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. The thought of Eleanor leaving, of Mason Ridge returning to its former emptiness, struck him with unexpected force. He looked at her, trying to read her expression, but her face remained carefully composed. "I'm content with my current situation," she replied, her eyes not meeting Emmett's. "But thank you for the consideration." Jenkins nodded, seemingly unsurprised, "Of course. But should you change your mind, ... single quotes." He reached into his pocket, extracting a small card which he placed beside her plate. "We'll be in the area for several weeks yet." The rest of the meal passed in strained conversation. When it concluded, Jenkins returned to his earlier topic with renewed determination. "I'll be direct, Mr. Blackwood. The Western Pacific is prepared to offer $10,000 for the right-of-way through your eastern section." The sum was substantial, more money than Mason Ridge would see in 5 good years. Emmett felt rather than saw Eleanor's reaction, a slight intake of breath quickly suppressed. "As I said, I'm not interested in selling any part of my land," Emmett replied, rising from the table to indicate the discussion was over. "But I appreciate your time, Mr. Jenkins." The railroad man gathered his portfolio, his disappointment evident. "I urge you to reconsider. This offer won't remain open indefinitely." "I understand." Emmett walked him to the door, aware of Eleanor clearing the table behind them. At the threshold, Jenkins paused. "Progress is like time, Mr. Blackwood. It waits for no man." His eyes drifted past Emmett to where Eleanor worked in the kitchen, and neither do opportunities of any kind. After seeing the man out, Emmett returned to find Eleanor washing dishes, her back to the room, her movements methodical. He stood watching her for a moment, struck again by how seamlessly she had become part of Mason Ridge, how empty it would feel without her. "You could have taken his offer," he said at last. "Railroad probably pays better." Eleanor turned, drying her hands on her apron. "I told you when I arrived, Mr. Blackwood. Distance doesn't trouble me." She paused, her eyes meeting his directly. "And neither does staying in one place, if it's the right place." The simple words carried a weight that settled in Emmett's chest, warm and unexpected. Before he could respond, she spoke again, her voice softer. "The cobbler, was it ... like hers?" The question caught him off guard. "No," he said honestly. "Hers was sweeter. Yours has more bite to it." He found himself smiling slightly. "I think I prefer yours." Something flickered across Eleanor's face, followed by a cautious pleasure that transformed her features. For a moment, Emmett glimpsed what she might have looked like as a young woman, for life had etched its lessons into the set of her mouth and the wariness in her eyes. "Good," she said simply, turning back to her work. But the line of her shoulders had softened, and when she resumed her humming, the tune was no longer melancholy. The railroad man's visit stirred up more than just dust at Mason Ridge. In the days that followed, Emmett found himself unusually restless, riding the boundaries of his property with a vigilance that surprised even his most loyal ranch hands. He told himself it was concern about the railroad's plan, about protecting land that had been in his family for generations. But in quiet moments, alone on the ridge overlooking the eastern pastures, he acknowledged a different truth. It wasn't just the land he was protective of, of anymore. Eleanor, for her part, continued her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her time at the ranch. If Jenkins's offer had tempted her at all, she gave no sign of it. The card he'd left remained on the small bureau in her room, untouched but not discarded. The only outward change in their routine was supper. Since the night of Jenkins' visit, Eleanor had taken to joining Emmett at the table, no longer waiting until he had finished to eat her own meal. Neither acknowledged this shift, as if drawing attention to it might somehow break the fragile newness of their arrangement. It was during one such meal, the windows open to catch the evening breeze, that Emmett finally broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. What Jenkins said about other ranchers signing agreements. I rode over to the Turner place yesterday. He set down his fork, his expression troubled. Jim sold his entire east quarter to the railroad, said they made an offer he couldn't refuse. Eleanor considered this, her face thoughtful. It's a difficult position. Many people can't afford to turn down that kind of money. Jim doesn't need the money, Emmett said, a hint of betrayal in his voice. His herd's one of the largest in the territory. Perhaps it wasn't just about the money. Eleanor's voice was careful, measured. People make choices for all sorts of reasons, some more visible than others. Emmett looked at her, struck by the underlying wisdom in her words. What would you do if it was your land? Question seemed to surprise her. She set down her cup, considering her answer. I've never owned land, she said finally. Never had anything that was truly mine to decide about. There was a wealth of history in that simple statement, and Emmett found himself wanting to know more. Never? Eleanor's eyes met his, something vulnerable flickering in their depths. My father was a tenant farmer. We worked other people's soil, lived in other people's houses. When he died, I had nothing but what I could carry. It was the most she had ever revealed about her past, and Emmett sensed there was much more left unsaid. And your husband? He asked, the question out before he could think better of it. A shadow crossed her face. He, left nothing behind but his name. Emmett nodded, not pressing further. The pain in her voice was too raw, too familiar. Instead, he returned to safer ground. I can't sell to the railroad, not just because it's family land, but because splitting the water source would ruin what remained. It would be the end of Mason Ridge as a working ranch. And you've made the right decision, Eleanor said simply. She rose to clear their plates. The conversation apparently concluded, but at the sink she paused, her back to him. Mere Blackwood. Yes, what you have here, this land, this home, it's worth protecting. She turned slightly, her profile outlined against the window. Some things, once lost, can never be recovered. The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that extended far beyond the railroad's proposition. Emmett found himself wondering which losses had taught her that lesson. What missing pieces had shaped the woman who now stood in his kitchen, strong and vulnerable all at once? Before he could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Voices raised in alarm, and the sound of hooves approaching at speed. Emmett rose quickly, moving to the door just as one of his ranch hands, young Billy Carson, leaped from his horse. "Hire, Mr. Blackwood," the boy gasped, his face streaked with sweat and soot, east pastures ablaze. Emmett grabbed his hat, already moving toward the barn. "Round up the men, get every water barrel on the wagons." "Eleanor," he called over his shoulder, "there are extra buckets in the storage shed." She nodded, already removing her apron, her face set with determination. "I'll bring them." Within minutes, the ranch was a flurry of activity. Men saddled horses, loaded water barrels onto wagons, grabbed shovels and burlap sacks. Emmett mounted his stallion, taking a moment to survey the horizon. A plume of dark smoke rose against the evening sky, angry and expanding. "Winds from the west," he muttered, calculating the fire's likely path. "It's heading straight for the creek bed." Eleanor appeared at his side, handling his rifle up to him. "You might need this," she said, her face grim. When he raised an eyebrow, she added, "Fires don't start themselves, Mr. Blackwood, not in this weather." The implication struck him forcibly. The railroad's warning, the pressure to sell, Jim Turner's capitulation. Coincidence seemed unlikely. He took the rifle, nodding his thanks. "Stay here," he told her. "If we can't contain it, I'll see what can be saved," she finished for him, understanding immediately. "Be careful." The ride to the east pasture was tense, the smell of smoke growing stronger with each passing minute. When they crested the final ridge, Emmett's heart sank. The fire was already substantial, a ravenous line of flame devouring the dry grass with frightening speed. Cattle bellowed in panic, fleeing before the blaze. "Billy Peterson, move the herd north," Emmett shouted. "Reynolds, take 4 men and start a fire break from the rocky outcrop. The rest with me to the creek. We'll try to flank it." For hours, they battled the flames. Men worked with grim determination, digging fire breaks, beating back the edges of the blaze with wet burlap, driving cattle to safety. The smoke burned their lungs, the heat blistering their skin. Twice the fire jumped their makeshift barriers, forcing them to retreat and regroup. It was near midnight when Emmett, hoarse from shouting orders and inhaling smoke, realized they were losing. The fire had reached the creek bed, normally a natural fire break, but dried out from weeks without rain. It jumped the shallow water, catching in the brush on the far side. "Fall back," he ordered, watching as the flames began to race toward a stand of old cottonwoods. "Get the men to safety." As they retreated, exhausted and defeated, Emmett noticed movement on the far side of the fire. A rider, barely visible through the smoke, watching the blaze. When the figure saw Emmett, it turned and galloped away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the firelight. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out, leaving behind a blackened wasteland where lush pasture had once stood. Nearly 500 acres destroyed, including the vital creek bed that provided water for much of the ranch. The cattle that hadn't been driven to safety lay scorched and still among the ashes. Emmett stood on the ridge, surveying the devastation as the sun rose. His men, exhausted beyond words, slumped on their horses beside him. The silence was heavy with what had been lost. "It'll take years to recover," Reynolds said quietly. "If we can't at all without that water source." Emmett said nothing. His eyes were fixed on the far side of the burned area, where hoof prints had been visible in the soft earth, prints that led away from the ranch, toward the town where Jenkins and his railroad men had taken rooms. The ride back to the ranch house was solemn, men too tired even for curses. As they approached, Emmett saw Eleanor standing on the porch waiting. Her face, smudged with ash, told him she had not spent the night idle. Empty buckets lined the side of the house, and wet sheets hung from the roof, preparations for a fire that thankfully hadn't reached the building. She stepped down as he dismounted, taking the reins from his blistered hands. "The men can rest in the barn," she said quietly. "I've made coffee and soup." Emmett nodded, too exhausted for words. She led his horse away, her back straight, despite what must have been a sleepless night. When she returned, she found him still standing in the yard, staring toward the east where smoke continued to rise from the smoldering land. "Come inside," she said gently. "You need to rest." He allowed her to guide him into the house, barely registering the cool cloth she pressed into his hands to wipe his face. He sat heavily at the table, his body aching from hours of fighting a losing battle. Eleanor placed a cup of coffee before him, strong and black. "Drink this, then you can sleep." "Sleep won't fix what's happened," he said, his voice a rasp. "No," she agreed, "but it will help you face what comes next." He looked up at her, really seeing her for the first time since returning. Her dress was stained with soot, her hands reddened from handling wet sheets and buckets. A small burn marked one forearm, already neatly bandaged. She had fought her own battle here, preparing to defend his home if the flames had reached it. "You could have left," he said, "taken the valuables and gone to safety in town." Eleanor's expression soft. "I told you before, Mr. Blackwood, some things are worth protecting." The simple statement, an echo of their earlier conversation, broke something inside him. The strain of the night, the loss of his land, the betrayal implicit in the arson, it all welled up, threatening to overwhelm him. "Emmett," he said suddenly. "My name is Emmett." She paused, surprise evident in her eyes. "Emmett," she repeated, as if testing the shape of it on her tongue. Then, with a small nod, "Eleanor." It was a simple exchange, nothing more than the offering of first names. Yet in that moment it felt like the crossing of a threshold neither had been willing to approach before. Not employer and employee now, but Emmett and Eleanor, two people standing together in the aftermath of destruction. "Rest," she said again, her hand briefly touching his shoulder. "I'll wake you if there's news." He caught her hand before she could withdraw it, holding it gently despite his smoke-blackened fingers. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for what he meant. "For staying." For finger quotes, he gestured vaguely at the house, still standing, still safe. Eleanor's fingers tightened briefly around his. "This is my home too," she said quietly, then slipped her hand free and moved back to the stove. Emmett watched her for a moment longer, those four simple words echoing in his mind. Then, bone-weary, he rose and made his way to his bedroom, falling onto the bed, still clothed. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of Eleanor's face in the firelight, determined and unafraid, standing guard over what they both now called home. News traveled fast in cattle country. By midday, neighbors began arriving at Mason Ridgeman on horseback, women in wagons bringing food, tools, and the silent solidarity of those who lived by the same unforgiving rules. Fire was every rancher's night, a common enemy that erased boundaries between properties and grudges between families. Eleanor met them in the yard, directing the women toward the kitchen and the men toward the eastern pastures where Emmett and his hands were still working to save what cattle had survived. She moved with quiet authority, accepting offerings of cornbread and stew, organizing a crew to prepare a meal for those fighting the last of the smoldering patches, all while keeping a watchful eye on the house where Emmett finally slept. "Never thought I'd see the day," Martha Turner commented as she helped Eleanor knead dough for extra bread. Mason Ridge with a woman's touch again. Eleanor's hands didn't pause in their rhythmic work. "It needed doing," she said simply. Martha, wife of Jim Turner, who had sold to the railroad, studied Eleanor's profile with undisguised curiosity. "You've done more than cooking, from the looks of things. Place hasn't been this alive since Sarah passed." The mention of Sarah, the second time in as many days that Emmett's wife had been named in her presence, caused Eleanor's movements to falter briefly. "I'm just doing what I was hired to do." Martha's laugh was kind but knowing. "Honey, no one gets hired to care the way you clearly do." She lowered her voice, leaning closer. "And it's about time Emmett Blackwood had someone to care for him again. Man's been nothing but a shadow these past years. Eleanor didn't respond, focusing intently on the dough beneath her hands, but Martha wasn't finished. Jim says Emmett refused the railroad's offer, says he's a fool to turn down that kind of money. It's his decision to make, Eleanor replied, her tone neutral. Martha sighed. Jim didn't want to sell either, but after what happened to the Petersons ... single quote, she trailed off, glancing toward the door as if worried about being overheard. Eleanor's hands stilled completely now. What happened to the Petersons? They refused to sell too. Then one night their barn burned down. A week later their best bull was found shot dead in the north pasture. Martha's eyes were serious now, the earlier gossip replaced with genuine concern. 3 days after that, they signed the papers. Jim figured it was only a matter of time before the same happened to us. A chill settled over Eleanor despite the warmth of the kitchen. You think the railroad was responsible for the fire here? Martha shrugged, but her expression was telling. I think powerful men used to getting their way don't take kindly to being refused. And I think Emmett Blackwood needs to be careful. She patted Eleanor's flour-covered hand. You both do. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more neighbors, but Martha's warning lingered in Eleanor's mind as she continued her work. When Emmett finally emerged from his room in the late afternoon looking slightly less haggard after a few hours' rest, she watched him carefully, noting the determined set of his jaw as he greeted the gathered neighbors. We appreciate the help, he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Eleanor with a brief nod of thanks. Fire took out most of the east pasture and the creek bed. We managed to save about half the herd, but we'll need to move them to the north section until we figure out a water solution. You can graze some on our west field, offered Ben Mitchell, an older rancher whose property bordered Mason Ridge to the north. Got plenty of water there too. Others made similar offers, temporary grazing rights, help rebuilding fences, extra hands to dig new wells if needed. Emmett accepted with quiet gratitude, though Eleanor noticed how the mention of water made the lines around his eyes tighten. Without the creek, Mason Ridge's future as a viable ranch was in serious jeopardy. As evening approached, the neighbors began to disperse, leaving behind provisions and promises to return the next day. Emmett walked the last of them to their wagons, standing in the yard long after they had disappeared down the dusty road. Eleanor found him there as dusk settled, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. She approached quietly, carrying a shawl against the evening chill. You should come in, she said, stopping beside him. There's hot food waiting. Emmett didn't turn. Did you know, he said, his voice low, that my grandfather dug that creek bed deeper with his own hands? Spent 3 summers widening it, making sure it would hold water even in the driest years. He shook his head. All that work, gone in one night. Eleanor wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, weighing her words carefully. Mrs. Turner mentioned something today about the Petersons. Emmett's posture stiffened. Martha talks too much. True? About their barn, their bull? He turned to her then, his expression hard to read in the failing light. Yes. And you believe the railroad was behind it? I can't prove it, he said after a pause, but yes. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. They'll come again. With another offer? Or worse. I know. What will you do? Emmett's gaze shifted to the eastern horizon, where the blackened remains of his pasture stretched like a scar across the land. Fight, I suppose. It's all I know how to do. There was a weariness in his voice that tugged at Eleanor's heart. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand coming to rest lightly on his arm. You don't have to fight alone. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. For a moment she thought he might step away, re-establish the careful distance they had maintained for months. Instead, he covered her hand with his own. I've been alone a long time, Eleanor, he said quietly. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else. The honesty in his word, the vulnerability beneath the strength made her breath catch. Perhaps it's time to remember then. They stood like that, connected by the simple touch of hand, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. It was Emmett who finally broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion he seemed unwilling to name. We should go in. It's getting cold. Eleanor nodded, letting her hand slip from beneath his as they turned toward the house. But something had shifted between them. A change as subtle and profound as the turning of seasons. Inside, the kitchen was warm and fragrant with the day's cooking. Eleanor moved to serve the stew she'd kept simmering, while Emmett washed up at the basin by the door. They ate in companionable silence, both too tired for conversation, yet aware of each other in a way that made words seem superfluous. It was only after the dishes were cleared and coffee poured that Emmett spoke again. The railroad will send someone tomorrow. Maybe Jenkins, maybe someone higher up. Eleanor set her cup down carefully. What will you tell them? The same thing I said before. Mason Ridge isn't for sale. Not part of it, not all of it, even without the creek. Emmett's face hardened, especially without the creek. I won't reward them for destruction. Eleanor studied him, taking in the stubborn set of his jaw, the determination in his eyes. They'll say you're being foolish, that without reliable water the ranch can't survive. They'd be right, he admitted. But there are other solutions. Mitchell's offer of access to his water. We could dig wells, build cisterns for catching rain. All expensive, Eleanor pointed out gently, and not guaranteed. Emmett leaned forward, his eyes intense. What are you saying, Eleanor? That I should give in? Sell to the men who burned my land? She met his gaze steadily. I'm saying nothing of the sort. I'm saying that whatever you decide, you should do it with clear eyes. Not out of pride or anger, and if clear eyes tell me to keep fighting. A small smile touched her lip. Then I'll help you dig those wells myself. The tension eased from his shoulders, replaced by something that might have been surprise or perhaps gratitude. Why? He asked, the question barely above a whisper. Eleanor looked away, her hands tightening around her cup. I told you before. This is my home too now. Is that the only reason? The directness of his question caught her off guard. She looked up to find him watching her intently, waiting for an answer she wasn't sure she was ready to give. "No," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "It's not the only reason." Emmett nodded, seeming to understand all she wasn't saying. "Get some rest," he said, rising from the table. "Tomorrow will come early enough." But as he moved past her toward his room, he paused, his hand coming to rest briefly on her shoulder. The touch was gentle, almost tentative, gone as quickly as it had come. Yet Eleanor felt it like a brand, warming her skin through the fabric of her dress. When he had gone, she remained at the table, her coffee cooling untouched before her. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its lonely voice carrying across the yard. Eleanor listened, remembering another time, another place when she had sat alone in a kitchen not her own, making decisions that would alter the course of her life. She had come to Mason Ridge seeking sanctuary, a quiet place to rebuild what had been broken. She had not expected to find someone whose broken pieces matched her own, or to discover that in healing his home she might begin to heal herself. Rising at last, Eleanor moved to extinguish the lamps, her movement sure in the familiar space she had made her own. Tomorrow would indeed come early, bringing with it challenges she could only partly anticipate, but for the first time in longer than she cared to remember, she faced the future not with dread, but with a quiet determination that felt surprisingly like hope. In her small room off the kitchen, she removed the railroad man's card from her bureau drawer, studying it in the dim light from her single candle. Then with deliberate movements, she tore it in half and dropped the pieces into the small stove that heated her quarters. The paper curled and blackened, consumed by flames far smaller but no less transformative than those that had ravaged the eastern pasture. Eleanor watched until nothing remained but ash, her decision made long before Emmett had asked what she would do. Some loyalties, once given, could not be divided or sold, not for any price the railroad might offer. The railroad men came as Emmett had predicted, their polished boots incongruous against the charred earth of the eastern pasture. This time it wasn't just Jenkins, but an older man as well, silver-haired and expensive-looking in a tailored suit that had never seen a day's honest labor. He introduced himself as Howard Garrison, Regional Director for Western Pacific. Emmett met them at the property line, his rifle not pointed at them but present nonetheless, resting in the crook of his arm like an extension of his will. The message was clear. They were not welcome at the house. Not after what had happened. "Miss Blackwood," Garrison began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "This unfortunate incident presents us with an opportunity to reconsider our mutual position." "There's nothing mutual about arson," Emmett replied flatly. Garrison's expression registered mild offense. "I assure you, Western Pacific had nothing to do with this fire. Tragic accidents happen in this wilderness. Surely you know that better than most." The implication that Emmett was somehow responsible for his own misfortune hung in the air between them, sharp as a knife's edge. "What do you want, Garrison?" Emmett asked, his patience wearing thin. The railroad man smiled, a practiced expression that never reached his eyes. "To offer you a solution. Your ranch has suffered a devastating blow. Without that creek, your cattle operations are severely compromised." He gestured toward the blackened landscape. "We're prepared to offer $15,000 for the entire property. A generous sum, considering the circumstances." Emmett's grip on his rifle tightened. "So that's your game. Burn me out, then buy me cheap." Jenkins stepped forward, his tone conciliatory. "Mr. Blackwood, be reasonable. The railroad is coming through this territory whether you sell or not. The governor has approved the use of eminent domain if necessary. This offer allows you to leave with dignity and substantial compensation." "Dignity?" Emmett repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "Is that what the Petersons got when you shot their bull? What about Jim Turner? Did he feel dignified when you threatened his family?" Garrison's smile never wavered. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Blackwood. Completely unfounded, of course. We're businessmen, not thugs." "Businessmen don't usually carry this," Emmett said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small metal object. He held it up so the sun caught it. A brass button, emblazoned with the Western Pacific logo. "Found this near where the fire started. Curious thing to lose while inspecting railroad routes, wouldn't you say?" A flicker of discomfort crossed Jenkins' face, but Garrison remained impassive. "A simple coincidence. Our surveyors have been all over this region. Convenient coincidences seem to follow you, gentlemen." Emmett pocketed the button. "My answer remains the same. Mason Ridge is not for sale. Not part of it. Not all of it. Now get off my land before I forget my manners entirely." For a moment, tension crackled between them like static before a storm. Then Garrison nodded, seemingly unruffled. "As you wish, Mr. Blackwood. But remember, this offer expires at the end of the week. After that, well, the price of progress can be unpredictable." The threat hung in the air as the men returned to their horses, mounting with practiced ease. Before riding away, Garrison turned back, his eyes cold despite his smile. "By the way, that woman you've hired, Mrs. Walsh, isn't it? You might want to ask her about her time in Billings, specifically why she left in such a hurry." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Mr. Blackwood." Emmett watched them go, unease settling in his gut like a stone. The mention of Eleanor, the implication that the railroad knew something about her past, left him unsettled. In a way, their threats against his land had not. He returned to the house to find Eleanor in the kitchen, kneading dough with quick, efficient movements. Flour dusted her forearms, and a strand of hair had escaped her usually immaculate bun to curl against her cheek. She looked up as he entered, her expression questioning. "They're gone," he said, setting his rifle by the door. "For now, And their offer, $15,000 for the whole ranch. Emmett moved to the basin, washing trail dust from his hands. Generous, they called it, considering the accident that destroyed our water. Eleanor's hands stilled in the dough. You refused. It wasn't a question, but Emmett answered anyway. Yes, she nodded, resuming her work. What happens now? Emmett dried his hands, watching her for a moment before speaking. Garrison mentioned you, he said carefully. Said I should ask about why you left Billings in a hurry. Eleanor's movements faltered, her shoulders tensing. She kept her eyes on the dough, her voice carefully neutral. Did he? Yes. Emmett leaned against the doorframe, giving her space but making it clear he wasn't leaving. Is there something I should know, Eleanor? She remained silent for a long moment, her hands working the dough with more force than necessary. Then with a deep breath, she wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face him. Before I came here, I was employed as a housekeeper for a man named Edward Carrington, a businessman with connections to the railroad. She met Emmett's gaze directly, though her hands twisted in her apron. His wife had died the year before. He had 2 young children who needed looking after. Emmett nodded, encouraging her to continue. At first, it was just a position, good wages, a respectable household, but Mr. Carrington, he began to take notice of me, not as a housekeeper. A faint flush colored her cheeks. I made it clear his attention was unwelcome, but he persisted. Said no one would believe a plain-faced widow over a man of his standing. Anger flared in Emmett's chest, hot and immediate. Forced himself on you? He tried, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the painful memory. One night when the children were asleep, I defended myself with a fireplace poker. Understanding dawned on Emmett. You heard him. Broke his arm in 2 places. There was no regret in her voice, only a grim satisfaction. I left that night, took what little I had, and got on the first stage out of town. I heard later he told everyone he'd fallen down the stairs. And now the railroad is using this against you, Emmett concluded, the pieces falling into place. Carrington must have connections to Garrison. Eleanor nodded. If they can't force you off your land through threats or destruction, perhaps they thought they could do it by discrediting the woman you've taken in. The phrasing, the implication that people might view her presence at Mason Ridge as improper hung between them, unaddressed but acknowledged. You should have told me, Emmett said quietly. Eleanor's chin lifted slightly. It wasn't relevant to my cooking. Despite everything, the corner of Emmett's mouth twitched. No, I suppose it was. A moment of silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but weighted with all that remained unsaid. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice soft but resolute. If my presence here complicates things for you, I understand. I can find another position. The thought of Eleanor leaving of Mason Ridge without her steady presence struck Emmett like a physical blow. Is that what you want? He asked, his voice rougher than he intended. No, she answered simply. But what I want has rarely mattered in this world. Something in her words, in the quiet dignity with which she faced potential rejection, broke through the last of Emmett's carefully constructed defenses. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, stopping just short of touching her. It matters to me, he said, his voice low and certain. What you want matters to me, Eleanor. Her eyes widened slightly, surprise and something deeper flickering in their storm-gray depths. For a heartbeat they stood frozen, the air between them charged with possibility. Then the door banged open as Billy Carson burst in, breathless with urgency. Miss Blackwood, riders comin', looks like trouble. The moment shattered. Emmett stepped back, his expression shifting from intimate to alert in an instant. How many? 4? Maybe 5? Armed, moving fast. Emmett nodded, already reaching for his rifle. Eleanor, lock yourself in your room. Billy, get Reynolds and whoever else is nearby. Tell them to arm themselves. As Billy dashed out, Eleanor caught Emmett's arm. Be careful, she said, the simple words carrying the weight of everything still unresolved between. He covered her hand with his own, a brief touch that conveyed more than words could. Always am. Outside, hoofbeats approached rapidly. Emmett stepped onto the porch, rifle ready, as 5 riders thundered into the yard. They weren't railroad men, he realized with a mix of relief and new concern. These were rougher characters, trail hands or drifters, their expressions hard beneath dust-caked hats. Their leader, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left cheek, reined in his horse a few yards from the porch. Blackwood? He called, his voice carrying the rasp of too much whiskey and tobacco. That's right, Emmett replied, not lowering his rifle. State your business. The scarred man grinned, revealing a gap where his front teeth should have been. Heard you might be having some trouble with the railroad. We're here to offer our services. What kind of services? Emmett asked, though he already suspected the answer. Protection, the man replied, spreading his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. For a modest fee, of course. Way I hear it, accidents happen pretty regular to folks who cross the Western Pacific. Be a shame if any more ... accidents befell this nice ranch of yours. Behind Emmett, the door opened slightly. He didn't need to look to know Eleanor stood there, listening. The implications were clear. These men were offering to fight the railroad's intimidation with intimidation of their own, for a price that would likely bleed Mason Ridge dry as surely as the loss of the creek. Not interested, Emmett said flatly. We handle our own problems here. The scarred man's grin widened. Might want to reconsider, Blackwood. Railroad's got deep pockets. Deeper than yours, I'd wager. Especially with half your herd lost and no water for what remains. You heard him, came Eleanor's voice from the doorway, steady and clear. We're not interested. The men's eyes shifted to her, and Emmett felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it nearly took his breath away. The leader's expression changed, a calculating look replacing his earlier bravado. Well now, he drawled, didn't know Blackwood had himself a woman. Changes things, don't it, boys? The men behind him chuckled, the sound ugly with implication. Emmett raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel at the man's chest. "You've delivered your message. Now get off my land before I decide you're just another accident waiting to happen." The threat hung in the air, deadly serious. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Reynolds appeared from the side of the barn, shotgun in hand, with 2 more ranch hands similarly armed flanking him. The scarred man's smile faded. Outnumbered and outgunned, he nodded slowly. "Have it your way, Blackwood. But remember, our offer stands. When the railroad comes back, and they will, you might wish you'd taken us up on it." With that, he wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. They rode out as they had come, fast and hard, leaving only dust and an unsettled quiet behind. When they had disappeared from view, Emmett lowered his rifle, turning to find Eleanor still standing in the doorway. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes meeting his with a steady gaze that spoke volumes. "Trouble comes in pairs," she said softly, an old saying that seemed particularly apt. Emmett nodded, moving to join her on the porch. "Seems that way." They stood side by side, looking out over the ranch, damaged but still standing, threatened but not defeated. Without conscious thought, Emmett reached for Eleanor's hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. She didn't pull away. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a deceptive tranquility settling over Mason Ridge. Emmett rose before sunrise, as was his habit, to find Eleanor already in the kitchen. She worked silently, efficiently, the routine of breakfast preparation, a familiar dance in the pre-dawn light. But there was something different in the air between them, an awareness, a current of unspoken words flowing beneath their usual quiet companionship. "You're up early," he said, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd already prepared. Eleanor glanced up from the biscuits she was cutting. "Couldn't sleep. Too much thinking to do." Emmett nodded, understanding perfectly. He'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, his mind racing between the railroad's threats, the hired gun's offer, and the memory of Eleanor's hand in his as they stood together on the porch. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said, settling at the table. Eleanor placed the biscuits in the oven before joining him, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "Yes, we do." For a moment neither spoke, the weight of decisions yet to be made hanging between them. It was Eleanor who finally broke the silence, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. "The ranch can't survive without water, Emmett. Not long term. Mitchell's offer is generous, but it's not a permanent solution." "I know." He cupped his hands around his coffee mug, drawing comfort from its warmth. "I've been thinking about digging a new well closer to the house. There might be an underground spring we could tap into. That would be expensive." "Yes," admitted. "More than I have on hand. But if we sell some of the remaining herd, you'd be crippling the ranch's future income," Eleanor pointed out gently. Emmett's jaw tightened. "What would you have me do? Sell to the railroad?" "No." Her answer was immediate and firm. "But there might be another way." He looked up, surprised by the determination in her voice. "What do you mean?" Eleanor took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "I have some money, saved from my time with with the Carringtons and before. It's not a fortune, but it might be enough to help with a well." Emmett stared at her, astonished. "You'd invest your savings in Mason Ridge? After everything that's happened?" "I told you before," she said simply. "This is my home now." The simplicity of her statement, the quiet certainty behind it, struck Emmett with unexpected force. This plain-faced woman who had arrived on his doorstep 4 months ago with nothing but a trunk and a determination to make a new start was now offering to tie her future to his land, to him, without reservation. "Eleanor," he began, then stopped, unsure how to express what her offer meant. She misinterpreted his hesitation. "Of course, I understand if you'd rather not accept. It would change things between us." "Things have already changed," he said quietly. "Haven't they?" Their eyes met across the table, neither able to deny the truth in his words. Whatever had existed between them when she first arrived, the careful distance of employer and employee, had evolved into something neither had anticipated, something neither seemed quite ready to name. "Yes," she acknowledged, "they have." Emmett reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. "I can't ask you to risk your savings, not when the railroad might still—" "You're not asking," she interrupted. "I'm offering. And as for the railroad, single quotes, her expression hardened. "I've faced worse threats than Howard Garrison and his kind." A wry smile tugged at Emmett's mouth. "Like Carrington and his broken arm?" To his surprise, Eleanor laughed, a genuine sound he'd heard all too rarely. "Exactly like that." The tension between them eased, replaced by a warmth that felt both new and familiar, like returning to a home you'd forgotten you missed. "All right," Emmett said at last. "We'll use your money for but as an investment, not a gift. You'll have partial ownership of Mason Ridge, everything legal and proper." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "Emmett, I don't need—" "I do," he said firmly. "If we're in this together, we're in it as equals." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "As equals, then." The biscuits began to fill the kitchen with their comforting aroma, a homely counterpoint to the gravity of decisions being made. Eleanor rose to check the oven, moving with the same quiet grace that had first caught Emmett's attention all those months ago. Watching her, he was struck by how seamlessly she had become part of his life, how empty the house and his days would feel without her. "There's something else we need to discuss," he said as she returned. "What Garrison said about you, about why you left Billing." Eleanor tensed visibly. "I told you what happened." "You did," Emmett agreed. "But if the railroad is willing to use it against against us, we need to be prepared." She sighed, a small sound of resignation. "What do you want to know?" Everything, he said gently. Not because I doubt you, but because I need to understand what we're facing. Eleanor was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was measured, as if carefully distancing herself from the memories. Edward Carrington was an influential man in Billings. Railroad investor, bank shareholder, friend to politicians. After his wife died, he hired me to keep his house and mind his children. She paused. I was grateful for the position. My previous employment had ended when the family moved east, and good situations are hard to come by for women like me. Women like you? Emmett echoed, uncertain of her meaning. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Plain-faced widows with no family connections. Were respectable enough for service, but not ... desirable enough for marriage. Or so I believed. The self-assessment, delivered with such matter-of-fact acceptance, stirred something protective in Emmett's chest. He wanted to protest, to tell her how wrong she was, but held his tongue, sensing she needed to continue uninterrupted. Carrington was kind at first, too kind, bringing me small gifts, complimenting my work with his children. I should have recognized the signs, but ... single quotes. She shook her head. I needed the position, so I ignored them, maintained my professionalism. Then one night he came to my room, drunk, demanding ... things no employer should ask of his housekeeper. Emmett's hands clenched into fists at the thought, but he remained silent. I refused. He grew angry, said I'd been leading him on, that a woman like me should be grateful for his attention. Her voice hardened. He tried to force the issue. I reached for the first thing I could find, the poker from the fireplace I'd been tending. One swing was all it took. You defended yourself, Emmett said firmly. Any court would see that. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. Courts see what powerful men tell them to see. Carrington's story, a clumsy fall down the stairs, was accepted without question, but we both knew the truth. And when I went to collect my final wages, he made it clear what would happen if I stayed in Billings. So you ran. I left, she corrected, her chin lifting slightly, with my dignity and my freedom, if not my reputation. 2 days later, I saw your advertisement in the paper. Emmett considered this, be the pieces of her story fitting together like a puzzle finally solved. And now Carrington is working with the railroad, using your past to pressure us. Yes, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I'm sorry, Emmett. I never meant to bring trouble to your door. The trouble was already here, he reminded her. The railroad would have found another way to press their advantage. He reached for her hand again, his touch gentle but insistent. I'm not sorry you came to Mason Ridge, Eleanor. Not for a single day. The admission hung between them, simple but profound. Eleanor's eyes, usually so guarded, softened with an emotion Emmett dared not name, though he felt its echo in his own heart. The moment was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching, not the thunderous arrival of trouble, but the measured pace of a single rider. They both rose, moving to the window to see Ben Mitchell dismounting from his horse, his expression urgent even at a distance. Something's happened, Eleanor murmured. Emmett nodded, already moving to the door. Mitchell had barely reached the porch when Emmett stepped out to meet him, Eleanor close behind. Ben, he greeted the older rancher. What brings you by so early? Mitchell removed his hat, revealing a face lined with concern. Bad news, I'm afraid. The Turner place was hit last night. Barn burned to the ground and someone shot up their water pump. Emmett frowned. I thought Jim sold to the railroad. Why would they target him now? That's just it, Mitchell replied, his voice lowered though there was no one else to hear. Jim says he was having second thoughts. Told Jenkins yesterday he was reconsidering the deal, maybe planning to back out. He glanced at Eleanor, then back to Emmett. Word is he got the idea from you. Standing your ground despite the fire. A cold weight settled in Emmett's stomach. Is everyone all right, Martha, the kids? Shaken up but not hurt. Jim's pretty broken, though. Says he's signing the papers today no matter what. Emmett exchanged a glance with Eleanor, seeing his own concern mirrored in her eyes. The message was clear. The railroad was escalating, willing to attack even those who had initially cooperated if they showed any sign of resistance. Thanks for letting us know, Ben, Emmett said, his mind already racing ahead to what this meant for Mason Ridge. You be careful. Keep your family close. Mitchell nodded grimly. You too, Emmett. Those railroad men, they're not playing by any rules, I understand. His gaze shifted to Eleanor. Ma'am. After Mitchell had gone, Emmett and Eleanor stood in silence, the weight of this new development settling over them like a shadow. They're getting bolder, Eleanor said quietly. More desperate. Emmett nodded, his expression hardening, which means we need to move faster. I'll ride into town today, speak with the bank about a loan to supplement your investment. We'll start on that well immediately. And the railroad's deadline? Garrison said the offer expires at the end of the week. Let it expire, Emmett said firmly. Mason Ridge isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. Eleanor studied his face, searching for doubt and finding none. What if they come back? Not with offers, but with more men like those riders yesterday. Emmett's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with a familiarity that felt both new and inevitable. Then we'll face them together, he said simply, as equals. In that moment, standing in the early morning light, their futures as intertwined as their hands, Emmett realized that Mason Ridge had already been transformed in ways no railroad or fire could touch. This plain-faced woman with her quiet strength and unflinching loyalty had awakened something he had thought died with Sarah, a capacity for hope, for connection, for a future beyond mere survival. And no matter what came next, That was a treasure worth fighting for. Work on the well began the very next day. Emmett's visit to the bank had been surprisingly successful. The loan officer, an old friend of his father's, approved a modest sum to supplement Eleanor's saving. It wasn't enough to fully restore what the fire had destroyed, but combined with their own funds, it would cover the cost of digging a new water source. Word spread quickly through the neighboring ranches, and by mid-morning, a crew of volunteers had arrived at Mason Ridge, men who had faced the railroad's tactics themselves or who simply believed in standing together against outside threats. They brought tools, expertise, and a determination that matched Emmett's own. Eleanor moved among them, providing food and water as the summer sun beat down relentlessly. She had abandoned her usual severe bun for a practical braid, and her sleeves were rolled up against the heat. The men treated her with a respect that went beyond politeness. They had heard, through the efficient grapevine of ranch country, that she had invested her own money in Mason Ridge, that she had chosen to stand with Emmett rather than seeking safer ground. In their eyes, that made her something more than a cook or housekeeper. It made her a partner. The site for the well had been chosen carefully. A low spot near the house where the ground stayed damp even in dry weather, suggesting water beneath. Old Samuel Porter, who had been digging wells in the territory for 40 years, supervised the work. His weathered face creased with concentration as he assessed each shovelful of earth. "Looking good, Blackwood," he called out as the hole deepened. "Soil's getting darker. Damper. Might hit water sooner than we thought." Emmett, stripped to his undershirt and covered in dust, nodded his acknowledgement. He had been working steadily since dawn, taking his turn with the shovel alongside the other men. His muscles ached with the effort, but there was a satisfaction in the pain in doing something concrete to secure Mason Ridge's future. From the corner of his eye, he caught Eleanor watching him from where she distributed water to the resting workers. Their gazes met briefly across the yard, and something passed between them, an understanding, a shared purpose, perhaps something more. Then she looked away, a faint color touching her cheeks as she returned to her task. By late afternoon, they had reached 12 feet. The dirt was indeed damper now, a promising sign. Old Samuel called for a break, examining the walls of the shaft with a critical eye. "Another day, maybe two," he pronounced. Then we'll need to line it with stone to prevent collapse. But I'd wager my last dollar we'll hit a good spring down there." Emmett climbed out of the shaft, accepting the dipper of water Eleanor handed him with a grateful nod. "That's the best news I've heard in weeks," he said, drinking deeply. "It's not over yet," Eleanor reminded him quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble to appear at any moment. "No," he agreed, following her gaze. "But it's a start." As the volunteers dispersed for the evening, promising to return the next day, Emmett found himself standing with Eleanor in the yard, watching the sun sink toward the blackened eastern pasture. The contrast was stark: destruction in one direction, creation in the other, with Mason Ridge balanced too. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "When this is done, when we have water again, we should make some change." Eleanor glanced at him. "What kind of change?" "To the house," Emmett replied, his voice carefully neutral, though his heart quickened at what he was suggesting. "It's been the same since Sarah died. Maybe it's time for something different." Eleanor was silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. "What did you have in mind?" "The east room could be opened up, made into a proper dining area. The loft needs work, new windows, a better staircase, and your room, ... single quotes, he hesitated. "It's too small, not suitable for a partner in the ranch." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Eleanor's hands stilled at her sides, her eyes searching his face. "Emmett," she began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. "We don't have to decide anything now," he said quickly. "It's just, ... something to think about for the future." Before she could respond, the distant sound of approaching riders drew their attention. Emmett tensed immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that wasn't there. "Stay here," he said, already striding toward the house. "Emmett, please," Eleanor, his voice soft. "Just until I know who it is." She nodded reluctantly, though he could see she didn't like being left behind. Emmett retrieved his rifle from inside the door, then returned to the porch, eyes fixed on the horizon where dust marked the approach of at least 3 riders. As they drew closer, his grip on the rifle tightened. He recognized the lead rider, Jenkins, the railroad man. But it was the 2 figures flanking him that sent a chill through Emmett's blood. One was Garrison, the regional director. The other, a stocky man in an expensive suit, was Sheriff Taylor from town. They reined in their horses a respectful distance from the house, and Jenkins called out with forced joviality, "Evening, Blackwood. Hope we're not interrupting your supper." Emmett didn't bother with pleasantries. "State your business, Jenkins." Garrison stepped forward, his silver hair catching the last rays of sunlight. "We've come on a matter of some urgency, Mr. Blackwood. Our final offer expires tomorrow, as you know." "My answer hasn't changed," Emmett replied flatly. Jenkins sighed dramatically. "We feared as much, which is why we've brought Sheriff Taylor with us today." He gestured to the lawman. "Sheriff, if you would." Taylor dismounted heavily, his expression uncomfortable as he approached the porch. From his pocket, he withdrew an official-looking document. "Emmett Blackwood," he began formally, "I'm here to serve you with an eviction notice under the authority of the territorial government." As of noon tomorrow, Mason Ridge Ranch will be seized under eminent domain for the construction of the Western Pacific Railroad. Emmett stared at the paper being extended toward him, disbelief warring with fury in his chest. This is impossible, he growled. You can't just take a man's land. I'm afraid they can, came Eleanor's voice from behind him. She had moved to stand in the doorway, her face pale but composed. If they have the governor's approval. Garrison smiled thinly. Mrs. Walsh is correct. The documentation is all in order, signed by Governor Harrison himself. The Western Pacific has been deemed essential to the territory's economic development. His smile widened. However, we are still willing to offer compensation, $10,000 to be paid upon your peaceful departure. 10,000? Emmett's voice was dangerously quiet. You offered 15 yesterday, Jenkins shrugged. Circumstances change. The cost of clearing and preparing the land has increased our expenses. Emmett's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle, though he kept it pointed at the ground. And if I refuse to leave? Sheriff Taylor shifted uncomfortably. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Emmett. I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, but I've got no choice here. The law is the law, Emmett repeated bitterly. Seems the law bends pretty easily when there's railroad money behind it, Single quotes. Garrison's smile never faltered. You have until noon tomorrow to remove your personal belongings. Anything left behind becomes property of the Western Pacific. His gaze shifted to Eleanor. That includes any employees who might wish to reconsider their loyalties. Eleanor stepped forward, her spine straight as a ramrod. My loyalties are not in question, Mr. Garrison. The railroad director studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly as if confirming something he had suspected. Very well. Noon tomorrow, Mr. Blackwood. I suggest you use the time wisely. He turned to remount his horse, then paused. Oh, and one more thing. Mr. Carrington sends his regards. Mrs. Walsh is most interested to hear of your current situation. The color drained from Eleanor's face, but she didn't flinch. Tell Edward he should be careful on staircases. They can be so treacherous. Garrison's eyes narrowed slightly before he turned away. The three men mounted and rode off, leaving Emmett and Eleanor standing in the gathering dusk. The eviction notice clutched in Emmett's hand like a death sentence. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Emmett crumpled the paper in his fist, a gesture of defiance that felt hollow even as he made it. They've won, he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't fully express. They've taken everything. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. Not everything, she said quietly. Not yet. Emmett looked down at her, at the determination etched in every line of her face. Despite everything, the fire, the threats, now this legal maneuver that stripped him of his birthright, there was something unwavering in her presence that steadied him. What do we do? He asked, the question stripped bare of pride. Eleanor's eyes met his directly. We fight, she said simply. Not with rifles or fireplace pokers, but with their own weapons. Law. Money, influence. We don't have those things, Emmett pointed out, the bitterness creeping back into his voice. No, Eleanor agreed, but I know someone who does. Emmett frowned. Who? Harriet Carrington, Edward's sister-in-law. She never approved of his behavior toward the household staff, and she has considerable influence in certain circles. Hope flared briefly in Emmett's chest, then dimmed. Would she help us? Against her own family? She might, Eleanor said thoughtfully, especially if she knew the whole story. Harriet was devoted to Edward's late wife, her sister. She'd be furious to learn how quickly he dishonored that memory. Emmett considered this, turning the possibility over in his mind. Even if she agreed to help, there's no time. They're coming tomorrow. Then we buy time, Eleanor said firmly. The sheriff is your friend, or was your father's friend at least. Appeal to that. Ask for a delay, even a day or two. And if he refuses, Eleanor's expression hardened. Then we make it as difficult as possible for them to take Mason Ridge. The eviction notice may be legal, but it still requires your cooperation to be implemented smoothly. A slow smile spread across Emmett's face as he understood her meaning. You're suggesting we resist. Peacefully, but effectively, I'm suggesting, Eleanor replied, a matching smile touching her lips. That moving an entire ranch's worth of belongings takes time. Perhaps more time than the Western Pacific has allowed for in their schedule. Emmett looked out over Mason Ridge, the house, the barn, the half-dug well that represented their hopes for the future. Then back at Eleanor, whose quiet strength had become the foundation he now built upon. It's not much of a plan, he said honestly. No, she agreed, but it's better than surrender. The last light of day faded, leaving them in the blue twilight that precedes true darkness. Emmett reached for Eleanor's hand, their fingers interlacing as naturally as breathing. I meant what I said earlier, he said softly, about the changes to the house, about your place here. Eleanor looked up at him. Vulnerability and determination mingled in her gaze. I know, she whispered. And when this is over, we'll talk about it properly. It wasn't a promise of forever. It wasn't even a declaration of feelings that both recognized had grown between them. But in that moment, with the fate of Mason Ridge hanging by a thread, it was enough. A commitment to a future they would fight for together, whatever form it might take. Night settled fully over the ranch, stars appearing one by one in the vast Montana sky. Inside, a lamp glowed warm in the kitchen window, a beacon of defiance against the gathering dark. Dawn broke over Mason Ridge in a symphony of gold and amber, painting the scarred eastern pasture pasture with a beauty that belied its ruin. Emmett stood on the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the sunrise with the solemn appreciation of a man who feared it might be his last on this land. Behind him, the house hummed with activity. Eleanor had been awake since before first light, organizing, planning, preparing for whatever the day might bring. The ranch hands had arrived early, grim-faced but resolute, ready to stand with their employer against what all recognized as a grave injustice. "Reynolds is bringing the wagons around," Eleanor said, stepping out to join him. She looked tired. They had both slept little, but there was a determined energy about her that Emmett found himself drawing strength from. "Good." He nodded. "We'll start loading the essentials first. Furniture can wait." They had decided on a two-pronged approach. While appearing to comply with the eviction by packing their belongings, Emmett would ride into town to speak with Sheriff Taylor one last time, appealing for a delay. Meanwhile, Eleanor would send a telegram to Harriet Carrington in Billings laying out their situation and requesting assistance. It wasn't much of a plan, as Emmett had noted the night before, but it was the only one they had. "I've made a list," Eleanor said, handing him a neatly written page. "Things we can't leave behind, in order of importance." Emmett scanned it quickly. The ledgers containing records of the ranch's history, his father's pocket watch, the quilt Sarah had made their first winter together, and at the bottom added almost hesitantly, Eleanor's mother's Bible. Something caught in his throat at that last item, this small piece of herself that she had included among the treasures of his family history. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, his fingers entwining with hers. "We'll get it all," he promised, "and anything else that matters to you." Eleanor's eyes met his, a wealth of unspoken feeling passing between them. "Just be careful in town," she said softly. "Garrison won't take kindly to resistance, even peaceful resistance." Emmett nodded, reluctantly releasing her hand as Reynolds approached with the first wagon. "I'll be back by 11 with or without good news." The ride into town was tense, the familiar landscape passing by almost unnoticed as Emmett rehearsed what he would say to Sheriff Taylor. They had history. Taylor had served alongside Emmett's father on the town council years ago, had attended Sarah's funeral, had always treated the Blackwood family with respect. Surely that counted for something, even against the railroad's money and influence. Town appeared on the horizon, a cluster of wooden buildings gathered around the dusty main street like children huddled for protection. Emmett rode directly to the sheriff's office, tying his horse to the hitching post with deliberate care, giving himself time to master the anger that still simmered beneath his carefully composed exterior. The office was empty save for Taylor himself, seated behind his desk with papers spread before him. He looked up as Emmett entered, and the flicker of discomfort that crossed his face confirmed what Emmett had suspected. The man was not at peace with his role in this affair. Emmett Taylor greeted him, rising from his chair. "I didn't expect to see you in town today. Thought you'd be ... single quotes," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Packing up my life?" Emmett suggested, his voice leveled despite the bitterness of the words. "That's what Eleanor and the hands are doing right now. But I needed to talk to you first." Taylor gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, though I don't know what good talking will do at this point." Emmett remained standing. "I need more time, Bill. 3 days. That's all I'm asking." The sheriff shook his head slowly. "It's not up to me. The governor himself signed that order." After Garrison greased his palm, Emmett countered, "We both know that's how the Western Pacific operates." Taylor didn't deny it, which was answer enough. "Even so, my hands are tied. The eviction stands for noon today, and if we're not ready to leave by then, if it takes longer to pack up generations of history." A flicker of the old Taylor, the man who had once valued justice over expediency, showed in the sheriff's eyes. "I suppose it would take time to physically remove unwilling occupants. Paperwork would need to be filed for forcible eviction. Could add a day, maybe two, to the process." It wasn't much, but it was something. Emmett nodded his thanks. "I'll take what I can get." Taylor leaned forward, his voice dropping. "But listen, Emmett, Garrison's not a man to cross lightly. He's brought in hired men, not locals. They're staying at the hotel waiting for his orders. If you're still on that land when they come... He let the implication hang in the air between them. "I understand the risk," Emmett said quietly. "But Mason Ridge is worth fighting for. Is it worth dying for?" Taylor asked bluntly. The question hung in the air, unanswerable in its stark reality. Before Emmett could respond, the door opened and a young man in Western Union uniform stepped in. "Sheriff, telegram just came for you." Said it was urgent. He handed over a yellow envelope, then departed with a curious glance at Emmett. Taylor opened the message, his expression shifting from puzzlement to shock as he read the contents. He looked up at Emmett, then back at the telegram. "Well," he said finally, "seems you've got friends in high places, Blackwood. What are you talking about?" The sheriff handed over the telegram wordlessly. Emmett scanned it quickly, disbelief growing with each line. "Sheriff Taylor, stop eminent domain order against Mason Ridge Ranch. Temporarily suspended pending review. Stop governor's office investigating allegations of corruption and coercion by Western. Pacific Railroad stop maintain status quo until further notice. Stop Judge Harrison presiding. Stop Judge Harrison." Emmett looked up, confusion warring with hope. "The governor's brother?" Taylor nodded grimly. "The very same, and not known for his fondness for railroad money." He reclaimed the telegram, folding it carefully. "I don't know what strings you pulled, Blackwood, but they worked, for now at least." Emmett shook his head, as mystified as the sheriff. "It wasn't me," but even as he denied it, Understanding dawned. Eleanor's plan contacting Harriet Carrington. It seemed impossible that a telegram sent just that morning could have produced results so quickly. Unless... I need to get back to the ranch, Emmett said, already turning toward the door. Wait, Taylor called after him. What do I tell Garrison when he comes looking for an explanation? Emmett paused, a grim smile touching his lips. Tell him Judge Harrison sends his regards. The ride back to Mason Ridge was a blur. Emmett pushing his horse harder than was wise over the rough terrain. As he crested the final rise overlooking the ranch, he was met with an unexpected sight. A fine carriage stood in the yard, a matched pair of bays in the traces. Around it, activity continued, drench hands loading wagons, Eleanor directing their efforts from the port. But it was the woman standing beside her that caught Emmett's attention. Tall, elegantly dressed in a traveling suit that spoke of wealth and taste, with silver-streaked dark hair arranged in a fashionable coiffure. She turned as Emmett approached, revealing a handsome face marked by intelligence and determination. Eleanor stepped forward as Emmett dismounted, her eyes bright with barely contained excitement. Emmett, this is Harriet Carrington. She arrived just after you left for town. Emmett removed his hat, studying the newcomer with undisguised curiosity. Mrs. Carrington, I didn't expect to meet you in person. Single quotes. Harriet Carrington's smile was cool but not unfriendly. When Eleanor's telegram arrived, I was already en route to Helena on business. It seemed providential. Mrs. Carrington has connections with Judge Harrison, Eleanor explained. They've been friends since childhood. More than friends, once upon a time, Harriet corrected with a small smile. Thomas and I were engaged briefly many years ago. We've remained close. Understanding dawned on Emmett. You spoke with the judge about our situation. I did better than that, Harriet replied, satisfaction evident in her tone. I showed him evidence of Western Pacific's tactics, not just here, but across the territory. Edward has been less than discreet in his business deal, particularly when he's been drinking. And I've made it my business to document his indiscretions. Eleanor's hand found Emmett's, squeezing gently. The eviction has been suspended, she said, her voice trembling slightly with restrained joy. Pending a full investigation into the railroad's activities. I saw the telegram in town. Emmett confirmed, still struggling to believe their sudden change in fortune. But I didn't understand how it had happened so quickly. Harriet's expression softened as she looked at Eleanor. I've owed Eleanor a debt for some time. She was kind to my sister during her final illness. When others, including my brother-in-law, were less attentive, her gaze returned to Emmett, sharpening. And I despise bullies, Mr. Blackwood, whether they wear the mask of progress or not. We can't thank you enough, Emmett began, but Harriet waved away his gratitude. This is just the beginning, she cautioned. The Western Pacific has powerful allies, despite Edward's carelessness. Judge Harrison's intervention buys us time, but the fight is far from over. Us? Emmett echoed, raising an eyebrow. Harriet smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her composed exterior. I find I have a vested interest in the outcome, Mr. Blackwood, not just for Eleanor's sake, but because what happens here will set a precedent for other landowners facing similar pressure. She glanced at her carriage. I must return to Helena now. The judge will need all the ammunition we can provide to make this suspension permanent. As Harriet prepared to leave, she took Eleanor's hands in her own. You've found something worth fighting for, she said softly, her eyes moving briefly to Emmett. Something my sister never had with Edward, despite all his wealth. Don't let it go easily. Eleanor embraced the older woman with unexpected emotion. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. After Harriet's departure, Emmett and Eleanor stood in the yard watching the dust settle behind her carriage. Around them, the ranch hands had paused in their loading, sensing the shift in circumstances without needing to be told. Do we unpack? Reynolds asked, approaching cautiously. Emmett looked at Eleanor, whose face reflected the same cautious hope he felt. Yes, he decided, but keep everything accessible. This isn't over yet. As the men began returning items to the house, Emmett turned to Eleanor, taking both her hands in his. You did this, he said quietly. You saved Mason Ridge. She shook her head. We did it together. And as Harriet said, it's just the beginning. Even so, Emmett insisted. You were right not to surrender, to fight with the weapons we had. Eleanor's smile held a hint of mischief that transformed her plain features into something Emmett found breathtaking. I've learned that even the most powerful men have vulnerabilities, if one knows where to look. Emmett laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy that seemed to surprise them both. Then, without planning or hesitation, he drew her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that had been building between them since the day she arrived. Eleanor stiffened momentarily in surprise, then melted against him, her arms encircling his waist as she returned the kiss with a fervor that left no doubt about her own feeling. When they finally parted, breathless and slightly dazed, the yard had mysteriously emptied of ranch hands, leaving them alone in the golden light of midday. I've wanted to do that for longer than I care to admit, Emmett confessed, his hand still cradling her face as if she were something precious and fragile. So have I, Eleanor replied simply, her usual composure replaced by a radiant happiness that transformed her entire being. In that moment, with Mason Ridge temporarily safe and Eleanor in his arms, Emmett allowed himself to believe in a future he had thought forever lost. Not a return to what had been, but something new. built from shared struggle and unexpected joy. The battle with the railroad was far from over. Challenges remained, victories uncertain. But standing in the yard of the ranch that had seen both his greatest grief and now the beginning of his greatest happiness, Emmett Blackwood knew one thing with unshakable certainty. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Autumn came to Mason Ridge in a blaze of gold and crimson, the hills surrounding the ranch transformed by nature's alchemy. 3 months had passed since Harriet Carrington's timely intervention, months filled with uncertainty, legal battles, and the painstaking work of rebuilding what had been lost. The territorial court's ruling had come down just as the first leaves began to turn. Western Pacific's eminent domain claim was declared invalid, tainted by evidence of corruption and coercion. Governor Harrison, facing mounting scandal, had been forced to rescind his support for the railroad's expansion through private lands. The victory wasn't theirs alone. Across the territory, ranchers and farmers who had been bullied into selling celebrated the decision as justice long overdue. The eastern pasture remained scarred, but new growth had begun to emerge from the blackened earth. The creek would take years to recover fully, but the well completed just before the first frost provided enough water to sustain the reduced herd through winter and beyond. Mason Ridge would survive, changed but undefeated. Inside the house, changes were even more evident. The east room had been opened up as Emmett had suggested, creating a dining area large enough for the frequent gatherings that now marked life at the ranch. The loft had been renovated with new windows that caught the morning light, illuminating the fresh paint and polished floors below. And Eleanor's small room off the kitchen stood empty, its former occupant having moved into the master bedroom 6 weeks earlier, following a quiet ceremony performed by the circuit preacher with only their closest friends in attendance. Eleanor Blackwood, the name still new enough to bring a smile to her lips when she thought of it, stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew that filled the kitchen with savory aromas. Her hair, loosened from its customary braid, fell in soft waves around her shoulders, catching the afternoon light that streamed through windows she had polished to a gleam that morning. From the doorway, Emmett watched her, struck anew by the sight of his wife in their kitchen, the heart of a home that had once seemed beyond redemption. How different she looked from the stern, plain-faced woman who had arrived on his doorstep nearly 8 months ago. Her posture rigid with determination, her eyes guarded against disappointment. There was a softness to her now, a quiet contentment that transformed her features without fundamentally changing. She was still Eleanor, practical, resilient, uncompromising in matters of principle, but happiness had gentled the sharp edges grief had carved into her, just as it had done for him. "You're staring again," she said without turning, a smile in her voice. Emmett moved into the kitchen, no longer hesitating at thresholds both literal and figurative. "Can't help it," he replied, coming to stand behind her. His arms encircled her waist, chin resting on her shoulder as he looked down at the stew she tended. "Thinking about how lucky I am." Eleanor leaned back against him, her body fitting against his with the ease of belonging. "We made our own luck," she reminded him, a touch of her old practicality surfacing. "Both of us, true enough." Emmett pressed a kiss to the side of her neck, savoring the small shiver it produced. "But there was luck in it too. The luck of you seeing that advertisement. The luck of you being brave enough to start over in a strange place. The luck of you being willing to hire a plain-faced widow with a questionable past," she added, turning in his arms to face him. Emmett cupped her face in his hands, his expression serious despite the teasing note in her voice. "You'd stop calling yourself that." "What? A widow?" Her eyes danced with mischief. "I'm hardly that anymore." "Plain-faced," he corrected, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "I've never seen you that way." "Not really." A faint blush colored Eleanor's skin beneath his touch. Even now, months into their marriage, such direct compliments still caught her off guard, a legacy of years believing herself unremarkable at best. "You're biased," she said softly. "I'm observant," he countered, the old argument familiar and comforting between them. "And I know what I see when I look at you." What he saw, what he had slowly come to recognize over their months together, was a beauty that had nothing to do with conventional features and everything to do with the spirit that animated. The intelligence in her gray eyes, the quiet determination in the set of her mouth, the compassion that softened her expression when she thought no one was watching. These were the things that had drawn him to Eleanor, awakening feelings he had thought buried with Sarah. Their lips met in a kiss that began gently but deepened as Eleanor's arms wound around his neck, the wooden spoon in her hand leaving a damp spot on his shirt collar that neither noticed nor cared about. They had both been lonely for so long, starved for the simple comfort of touch, the affirmation of desire. Now they took every opportunity to remind each other that solitude was behind them. A chapter closed in favor of this new, shared story. A sudden hissing from the stove broke them apart, the stew threatening to boil over. Eleanor turned quickly to adjust the heat, laughing as Emmett reluctantly released her. "See what happens when you distract the cook?" she chided, though there was no real reproach in her tone. "Worth it," Emmett declared, leaning against the counter to watch her work. "Though I'd hate to miss out on that stew. Smells like heaven." Eleanor shot him a knowing look. "You say that about everything I cook, because everything you cook tastes like heaven," he replied promptly. "Especially compared to what I was eating before you arrived." "Beans from a can," she remembered, shaking her head, "and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with creek water." "Your words, not mine." Emmett grinned, remembering their first meal together. "Though you weren't wrong." Eleanor tasted the stew, adding a pinch of salt before recovering the pot. "It needs another hour." The hands won't be in until sunset anyway. Good, Emmett said, taking her hand and leading her toward the main room. There's something I want to show you. Curious, Eleanor followed him to the newly renovated dining area, where a package wrapped in brown paper lay on the table. It hadn't been there earlier, and she looked at Emmett with raised eyebrows. What's this? Open it and see, he urged, a hint of nervousness beneath his casual tone. Eleanor untied the twine carefully, then folded back the paper to reveal a leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with the words Mason Ridge Ranch in gold lettering. Beneath, in smaller script, Est, 1847, Blackwood and Walsh. Her fingers traced the letters, particularly the Walsh that acknowledged her contribution to the ranch's rebirth. Emmett, she breathed, touched beyond words. Open it, he encouraged, watching her face intently. Inside, the first page bore a simple dedication to Eleanor, who saw value in what was broken and strength in what was tender. The pages that followed contained not figures and accounts, as she had expected, but a history carefully recorded anecdotes and stories of Mason Ridge from its founding to the present day, written in Emmett's steady hand. I realize, he explained as she turned the pages with growing wonder, that we nearly lost more than land in the fire. We almost lost the stories, the history of this place. He took her hand, his voice growing softer. Sarah used to say that a home isn't just walls and a roof, it's the memories made within them. I want our children to know those memories. All of them. Eleanor's head snapped up at the mention of children, her eyes widened. Our children? A slow smile spread across Emmett's face. Well, I was hoping, single quotes, he trailed off, suddenly uncertain. That is, if you want. Yes, Eleanor interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I want that. Very much. The relief and joy that washed over his features made her heart swell. They hadn't discussed children explicitly, though the possibility had hovered on the edges of their conversations about the future. Now, seeing the hope in his eyes, Eleanor felt a matching hope unfurl within her, a vision of small feet running across wooden floors, of laughter filling rooms that had known too much silence. There's something I should tell you, she said, setting the ledger carefully on the table. She took his hands, drawing him down to sit beside her. I wasn't going to say anything until I was certain, but, single quotes, understanding dawned in Emmett's eyes, his hands tightening around hers. Eleanor, are you, She nodded, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise over the mountains. Spring, she said softly, according to Martha Turner, who's had enough of her own to know the signs. Emmett stared at her for a heartbeat, shock giving way to a joy so profound it seemed to transform him from within. Then he was pulling her into his arms, his laughter mingling with something that might have been tears as he pressed his face into her hair. Child, he murmured, the words reverent as a prayer. Our child, the next generation of Mason Ridge, Eleanor agreed, her own eyes damp as she held him close. Later, as dusk gathered and the ranch hands began to return from the day's work, Emmett stood once more in the doorway of the kitchen, watching as Eleanor moved about the room with practiced ease. The stew bubbled on the stove, filling the house with the promise of comfort and sustenance. Fresh bread cooled on the sideboard, golden crusted and aromatic. Eleanor looked up, catching his gaze across the warm, fragrant space that had become the heart of their home. The smile she gave him, open, loving, without reservation, made his chest tighten with a happiness almost too great to bear. 6 years of emptiness had preceded her arrival, 6 years of grief and solitude that had seemed without end. Now, watching his wife, this extraordinary, plain-faced woman who had awakened his dormant heart with nothing more than her quiet strength and simple truths, Emmett Blackwood offered a silent prayer of gratitude for second chance, for unexpected joy, for the courage to begin again when all seemed lost. Outside, the wind stirred the golden leaves of autumn, whispering promises of winter's rest and spring's renewal. Inside, warmth and light pushed back the gathering darkness as they had from the first day Eleanor had stepped across the threshold, bringing with her the possibility of a future Emmett had thought forever beyond. A plain-faced woman, hired as a cook, who had proven to be so much more. The simple words that had awakened his dormant heart hadn't been grand declarations or poetic phrases, but honest statements of commitment and value. This is my home too. Some things are worth protecting. We'll face it together. In the end, it was these truths offered without guile or calculation that had rebuilt what fire and grief had threatened to destroy. Mason Ridge stood, scarred but enduring, and within its walls, two people who had known profound loneliness had found in each other not just companionship, but completion. Eleanor gestured for Emmett to join her, a quiet invitation he would never again hesitate to accept. As he crossed the threshold into the warmth of her presence, Emmett knew with unshakable certainty that he had found his way home at last.